Maverick never believed in ghosts, not the kind that rattled chains anyway. But there were other kinds, the kind that wore dog tags and disappeared into clouds of smoke over enemy territory, leaving behind nothing but folded flags and unanswered questions. That morning had started like most others since his retirement. The hangar smelled like grease and old ambition. The tools were in their place, and the old FA-18 was catching the sun just right, like she still had one more run left in her. Maverick had just settled into his usual place by the workbench when the silence broke with the creak of the main door. And then, there he was. No warning, no grand entrance. Just the unmistakable silhouette of a man frozen in time. The others didn't recognize him at first. Hell, even Maverick hesitated. 30 years had carved lines into the man's face like war-etched scars into steel. But that walk, that stare, it was impossible to forget. His name had been buried with honors, Captain Edward Falcon Harrow. Officially listed MIA after an experimental recon mission over the Bering Strait in '95, everyone assumed he was shot down or caught in some classified mess the Pentagon would never admit to. But now the man walked straight into the hangar like time hadn't claimed him. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, scanning the room like he was back on a flight deck. One of the junior techs muttered something about ghosts. Another reached for his phone. But Maverick stood up, eyes narrowing. He'd flown with Falcon once, a legend in the sky, always 2 steps ahead of every maneuver, and 1 breath away from rewriting every rule in the book. He was also stubborn, reckless, and never the kind to follow orders when instincts screamed louder. Falcon finally said one thing. "Where's your CO?" But there was no commanding officer anymore. Not for Maverick. Just stories, dust, and memories that refused to die. The man wasn't confused or disoriented like you'd expect from someone who'd supposedly been lost for 3 decades. His eyes were clear, calculating, like he hadn't missed a day. What startled everyone more than his appearance was his calm. He wasn't seeking help. He wasn't looking to explain himself. He had come back with purpose. Later that day, after the hangar had been cleared and lockdown protocols were initiated, Maverick sat across from him in the private briefing room. Falcon hadn't changed into modern gear, still wore parts of his old flight suit under a heavy wool coat that had clearly seen better days. "What happened, Ed?" Maverick asked, finally breaking the silence. Falcon didn't answer right away. He looked at the walls, the clock, the surveillance camera in the corner. Then he smirked. "They'll be listening," he said. "They always do." It wasn't paranoia, not the way he said it. It was certainty, the kind that comes with experience. And then slowly, he began to talk. He'd been part of a mission not even Maverick had clearance to know about. Something about a new prototype aircraft, unmanned, intelligent, and built for high-altitude surveillance. Only it wasn't just the tech that was experimental. The mission itself was off books, arranged through channels Falcon said didn't answer to any flag. The flight had started normally, takeoff from an Arctic base under the cover of a solar storm. But halfway through the mission, Falcon claimed he'd encountered something. Not an enemy jet, not a weather anomaly. Something else. He was vague. At first, said it was a presence in the sky. No radar echo, no heat signature, just light. Blinding, artificial, moving with purpose, faster than anything he'd ever seen, even in training simulations that hadn't gone public. The systems in his cockpit had fried one by one. Communications went dead. Manual control failed. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a cold, metallic chamber, somewhere that didn't feel like Earth. No windows, no doors, just silence and a humming that vibrated in his bones. Most people would have laughed him out of the room by that point, but Maverick had seen enough strange things over the years to listen with more than just skepticism. Falcon claimed he'd been observed, that whatever held him didn't harm him, didn't speak, but watched, studied. Days, weeks, time, blurred. But when they let him go, it wasn't back to where he'd started. He said he'd awoken in a facility underground, no idea where, guarded by men who never gave names, only orders. For years, he'd been kept, interrogated, restrained, studied like he'd been contaminated. He wasn't allowed outside. No contact, just questions. What did you see? What did it say? What are you now? But they'd made a mistake. They assumed he'd broken. They assumed he was a prisoner. But Falcon had always been a pilot. Pilots escape. Cages. Even ones you can't see. The Pentagon denied everything. When Maverick reported the incident, all records related to Falcon's final mission came back classified. Eyes only. Even his official death certificate had been updated just last year. Someone, somewhere, wanted the world to believe Captain Edward Harrow had never returned. And now he stood at the edge of Maverick's hangar, watching jets taxi across the tarmac, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He said he'd come back because it was time. Time to talk. Time to reveal what he'd seen. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but because whatever was up there, it wasn't finished, and it was coming back. As night fell, Maverick stared at the old photo pinned above his desk. A black and white shot of Falcon during his academy days. Same smirk, same fire. He lit a cigar, knowing damn well the cameras were still watching. The past, it seemed, had a way of taxiing back onto the runway, unannounced and on fire. And sometimes, ghosts didn't haunt you. They walked in through the front door. Maverick had seen a lot in his years. Crash sites, ejections, mid-air stalls, nuclear briefings, and unspoken missions that the Pentagon would deny even existed. But nothing compared to sitting across from a man the entire Department of Defense had declared dead for 3 decades. Captain Edward Falcon Harrow didn't flinch under the low lighting of the secure debriefing room. The same one used for post-mission interrogations back in Maverick's active days. The steel walls were insulated, the mics were hidden, and even the oxygen felt controlled. Maverick watched him closely. The eyes weren't wild. They were sharp, laser-focused. If Falcon had been through trauma, and there was no doubt he had, he wasn't showing it the way command expected. No breakdown, no confusion, no desperation, just mission clarity. "You're not here just to make a statement, are you?" Maverick asked him, arms crossed. Falcon didn't blink. "I'm here because they're not ready." Maverick leaned forward. "Who?" Falcon gave a humorless smile. "Anyone with stars on their collars." The retired pilot sat back, letting the weight of that settle. This wasn't about declassification or medals that had never been awarded. It was bigger, the kind of big that slipped into locked basements and got buried under 6 levels of clearance. Falcon continued his story, this time with more detail. He described the interrogators, not military, not contractors, something in between. Civilians with access to tech that didn't belong in any inventory, sensors that could scan neural impulses, holographic debriefing rooms, artificial voices that adjusted to his brainwaves. "They wanted to know what I remembered," Falcon said. "But they were scared. They weren't mining for data. They were checking for damage." "What kind of damage?" Maverick asked. Falcon stared past him, his voice low. "Psychic bleed. Biological drift. Words I never heard in flight school." It sounded insane, but the way he told it, it wasn't hysteria. It was methodical. He spoke in the way pilots deconstruct flight paths and stall recovery. Exact, practiced, stripped of emotion. "They think I brought something back," Falcon said. That night, Maverick sat with the only people he still trusted, a handful of old pilots now working. Maintenance or flying private, each had brushed against missions they couldn't talk about. Each had seen things in the sky they couldn't explain. They sat in the rear hangar with beers and silence, watching the red light of the sun drop over the horizon. One of them, J.D. Rhodes, callsign Boomer, had flown recon off the Alaskan coast in '98, claimed his radar had picked up an object hovering above Mach 3 with zero engine heat. No one believed him. The tape had vanished before debrief. "I thought I was going nuts," Boomer said. "But if Falcon's telling the truth—" "He's not telling everything," Maverick interrupted, and that's what bothered him. Falcon hadn't mentioned where he'd escaped from, or how he got out. No transport logs, no fake ID, no route, no paper trail. Yet somehow, he walked into the one hangar Maverick just happened to be in. Coincidence? No chance. 2 days later, the men in suits arrived. Black Suburbans. No insignia, no names. They didn't knock, just walked in like they owned the air. Falcon was gone. Vanished from his holding room with no trace, no camera footage, no signs of struggle, no logs of an exit. It was as if he'd never been there at all. But Maverick had his dog tags, the same ones Falcon left behind on the bench, wrapped in an old flight map and a single note. "You still know how to fly in the dark." The government men didn't ask questions. They gave warnings. Maverick knew the routine. For your own safety, national interest, leave the past buried. He'd heard it all before. But this time, he wasn't some hotshot pilot pushing Mach 2. He was an old war horse with nothing left to lose, and Falcon was one of his own. That night, Maverick opened the flight map. It was old, pre-GPS, marked with coordinates, circled in red, far into the Arctic Circle, closer to Russian airspace than any sane pilot would dare to fly without triggering an international incident. And there, on the back of the map, scribbled in mechanical pencil, were 2 words: the Watchers. He didn't sleep that night. He remembered the rumors, stories of lights over the polar caps, of aircraft systems shutting down mid-flight, of weather anomalies that left experienced aviators vomiting from vertigo. No one ever filed official reports. They didn't want to end up in psych evals or worse. Desk jobs. Maverick knew the military had secrets. He'd protected some of them himself, but this felt different. Not a weapon, not a war, something else. The next morning, he sat in front of the hangar again. The sun was rising slow, as if even time didn't want to move forward. He looked at the tags in his hand, the cold steel pressing into his palm. Somewhere out there, Captain Edward Harrow was alive and running, and whatever was chasing him wasn't human. Maverick had stared at maps his whole life. From flight school to classified missions, he'd memorized coordinates, weather patterns, jet streams, and no-fly zones like a preacher memorizes scripture. But this one was different. The map Falcon had left wasn't just old, it was obsolete. The kind they stopped printing decades ago. Its creases were deep, worn by time and use, and the ink was fading like a memory slipping from the edge of consciousness. Still, the red circle stood out like a wound. It wasn't near any base, nor a known air corridor. In fact, it was inside a stretch of Arctic airspace so remote it didn't even register on commercial nav charts. Just ocean, ice, and silence. Maverick knew one thing. Falcon had marked it for a reason, and it was a place no one was supposed to go. He drove for hours, away from town, from base, from anything familiar. The farther he got from civilization, the clearer his mind became. There were no more analysts breathing down his neck. No more ghosts whispering what could or couldn't be real. Just the hum of the engine and the weight of what he was about to do. When he reached the airfield, an old friend was waiting. Call sign, Silo. Real name, Martin Kincaid, ex-test pilot turned conspiracy theorist turned bush pilot. He ran a semi-legal airstrip out of a hangar that looked abandoned from the road. Rusted signage, broken fencing, radar blind spots you could drive a truck through. But inside, Silo had built his own kingdom. Reinforced panels, EMP shielded, avionics, even a fridge full of black market military rations. Silo didn't ask questions. Not the normal kind anyway. He just looked at Maverick and said, "You saw him too, didn't you?" Maverick nodded once. Silo pulled out a case from under a tarp and slammed it on the workbench. Inside was a modified twin-engine Gulfstream. On the outside, it looked worn. But the insides, retrofitted with stealth composites and long-range fuel capacity, were more advanced than anything short of a Pentagon prototype. "Long-range," Silo said, tapping the map. "Autopilot calibration for Arctic storms, satellite nav, and enough shielding to keep you off the grid." Maverick looked at him sideways. "You're not surprised," Silo grinned. "Surprise died after Kosovo." In the air, the hum of the engines became the only companion. Maverick watched the landscape shift from mountains to tundra to nothing. Ice fields below looked like cracked glass. The sky above stretched wide and cold. Somewhere out here, Falcon had seen something, and Maverick was heading straight for it. At cruising altitude, he took out the map again. The red circle hovered over an island that didn't exist on GPS. No elevation data, no satellite scans. It was a blind spot, exactly the kind of place you hide something, or someone. That's when the interference began. It started as static. Then instruments blinked out, not all at once, but in sequence. Altimeter, gyro, HUD. One by one, they died. And in their place came something else. A low hum, not mechanical, not human. It pulsed in his headset like a heartbeat. He reached for manual control, but the stick fought him. The plane wasn't falling. It was being pulled, gently, like a feather caught in a current. Outside the window, lights moved beneath the clouds. Not planes, not flares, just orbs, 3 of them, hovering in formation, keeping pace with the jet at subsonic speed. Maverick didn't panic. He'd felt this before. Once, during a black mission over Siberia, when his plane stalled at 40,000 feet for no reason. They'd blamed ice buildup, but he'd always known it wasn't. This time, he knew he wasn't alone. The orbs moved closer, and the hum intensified, not in his ears, but in his skull. A frequency beyond sound, like a tuning fork striking something inside his mind. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. All systems came back online. HUD flickered green, engines leveled out, the orbs were gone, and ahead, a shape emerged. Through the mist. The island was real, not large but unmistakable. Black rock jutted from the ice like a scar, surrounded by freezing waters that churned with unnatural heat. Steam rose from fissures in the surface. The plane's sensors couldn't get a read on the temperature. Readings bounced between -50 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. There was no sign of life, but there were structures, ruins maybe, or outposts, metal towers twisted into shapes that didn't follow military design. No insignias, no windows. Just jagged steel frames, as if someone had tried to build antennas and failed, or succeeded at something else entirely. Maverick circled once, then twice. Landed on a stretch of packed ice, skis down, engines still warm. He stepped out into a silence so deep it felt ancient. Every step crunched like thunder beneath his boots. And then he saw it. Falcon, sitting on a crate near the edge of the tower. Ruins, wrapped in thermal gear, looking out at the sea like he'd never left. No flare, no beacon, just waiting. "You came," Falcon said. Maverick didn't answer. He sat beside him. For a long while, neither spoke. Just the wind, the ice, the quiet hum that still pulsed in Maverick's head, like a warning or a welcome. Then Falcon said, "They're not watching the skies anymore. They're watching us." Maverick turned. "Who?" Falcon looked up, eyes reflecting something Maverick couldn't see. "The ones we chased off Earth a long time ago, but never really left." Maverick had faced down MiGs, pushed the G limit past reason, and flown through more war zones than he could count. But nothing in his training, nothing in the deep archives of classified Top Gun briefings had prepared him for what Falcon told him next. Because this wasn't a story about a crash, it was a story about a cover-up. Falcon's voice was steady, measured, like someone who'd rehearsed his words for decades in the silence of exile. It started before the mission, he said. The brief came from Langley. No insignia, no chain of command, just coordinates. One objective: intercept and monitor. Maverick listened, eyes narrowed against the cold, his breath fogging between them. They said it was a rogue satellite. But we all knew that was bull. Satellites don't move like that. They don't hover, and they don't send encrypted pings in ultraviolet bandwidths. Falcon tapped the side of his temple. I had a feeling. That gut thing we get in the air? Mine was screaming, but I flew anyway. His voice grew softer. There were 5 of us. The Arctic sky stretched wide behind him, as if daring time to argue. 2 fighters, 1 recon jet, me in the lead. Falcon leaned forward, staring into the mist as though he could still see it. It appeared over the Chukchi Sea. Metallic, silent. No wings, no engines, no heat signature. It just was, hovering there, like it had been waiting for us. He clenched his fists. They told us to keep visual and report back, no engagement. But before we could blink, he stopped. They were gone. Maverick felt it then, not fear, but recognition. The same feeling he'd had in the cockpit when the instruments died. The same silence. The same pull. They were taken? Falcon didn't answer, just nodded once. When I came to, he said finally, I was lying on sea ice. No wreckage, no jet, no team. Nothing but the sky and a cracked visor. Maverick's voice was low. And no one came for you. Falcon gave a bitter laugh. Oh, they came, but not to rescue me. The transport that arrived was unmarked. The men who stepped out wore no patches, no ranks, no names, just suits. They didn't ask how he survived. They didn't ask what happened. They already knew. They took me to a place underground, Falcon said. No windows, no clocks, just rooms. He described a concrete complex below a remote base, likely Greenland, possibly Alaska, maybe even inside the US. They never told me, he said. They didn't have to. It was designed for forgetting. Interrogations lasted hours, or days. He couldn't tell. They'd play strange frequencies, show him flashing images. Some days, they'd feed him classified documents from missions he wasn't on, asking him what he remembered. Others, they left him alone in the dark. Maverick leaned in. Mind control, Falcon shrugged. Mind management, maybe. But why? That's the part I still don't understand, he admitted. Maybe they wanted to know if I saw it. Or maybe they were testing if it saw me. The one thing they hadn't expected was his escape. He'd waited years, built trust with the guards, pretended the programming had taken. Then, one night, during a systems test, a door opened for exactly 11 seconds. He ran, crossed through. Snow, stole a snowcat, found a fishing rig, eventually reached a shipping route and disappeared. 30 years, and I stayed off the grid, he said. But I knew one day I'd have to come back. Maverick was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been clawing at him since day one. Why now? Falcon's eyes turned hard. Because they're doing it again. Maverick sat, up straight. Falcon stood and walked to a nearby crate, opening it. Inside were files, real physical documents. Satellite prints, intercepted radio logs, even a torn page from what looked like an internal DoD threat assessment, marked Obsidian Clearance. He pulled out a folder and handed it to Maverick. It was stamped, Phase 2, Reintegration, Maverick. Flipped through it. Airfields, flight plans, civilian test pilots, hidden budgets laundered through weather research grants. Photos of objects that matched Falcon's description, hovering over Arctic airspace in 2023, again in 2024, then last month. They're building contact teams, Falcon said. And they're not using military. Maverick's jaw tightened. Why not? Because they don't want accountability, Falcon said. If it's contractors, there's no oversight. No congressional questions. No ethics boards. Just money and silence. Maverick looked up from the photos. Why give me this? Falcon paused. Because you still fly with your conscience. The wind picked up, a storm forming on the horizon. Maverick knew they had minutes, maybe less, before they had to lift off. But his mind was spinning. He'd always known there were secrets. Things buried so deep even admirals didn't know them. But this wasn't just buried. It was protected, weaponized. He looked at Falcon. What happens if they find out you're alive? Falcon smiled, sad and tired. They already know. He nodded toward the sky, and Maverick heard it. That hum again, far off in the clouds, barely audible, but unmistakable. The same sound from the cockpit. From the ice. Only this time it wasn't passive, it was tracking. The wind over the Alaskan plains had shifted. Something about the cold felt focused. Maverick had always trusted his instincts. In combat, they'd saved his life more times than logic ever could. And now, as Falcon closed the crate of classified secrets, Maverick felt it again. This wasn't the end. It was just the ignition. Do you still have it? Falcon asked quietly. Maverick blinked. What? The F-14. The one you pulled from mothballs. The one you flew in that last operation overseas. Falcon nodded toward the hangar. I need it. Maverick almost laughed. Almost. You want to take a 40-year-old bird back into the sky to chase a ghost? But Falcon wasn't smiling. No. I want to show the world I'm not the ghost. Inside the hangar, under a tarp stitched with salt and thyme, the F-14 Tomcat gleamed with quiet defiance. Maverick had kept it maintained, more out of sentiment than strategy. A reminder of a time when you knew who the enemy was, when steel and guts were enough. Falcon stepped close and ran his fingers along the fuselage. This jet saved my life, he murmured. Now it might save the truth. The plan they wouldn't go through official channels. That was the first rule. Falcon didn't trust the Navy. Not anymore. Too many ears, too many layers of clearance designed to mislead, not protect. Instead, they'd rely on ghost circuits, old allies, radar blind zones, and a satellite transmission window only Falcon knew existed. A gap in orbital coverage that lasted exactly 14 minutes. In that window, they would fly. Maverick ran diagnostics on the Tomcat while Falcon uploaded coordinates into an encrypted drive. These new objects, whatever they are, they respond to patterns. You don't find them, you lure them. How? Maverick asked. With memory. Falcon explained it like folklore, but it made a twisted kind of sense. The objects had appeared again and again in specific moments, over war zones, near forgotten crash sites, during electronic blackouts. They're drawn to echoes of trauma, he said, to people who survived something they weren't supposed to. Maverick raised an eyebrow. Like you, Falcon nodded, and like you. They launched under full moonlight. No tower clearance, no transponder, just the howl of twin turbines punching through the night. It felt right, like closure, or maybe suicide. The first hour was clean, northern sky like a sheet of black glass. 47,000 feet, Falcon switched to silent comms and activated a beacon, a signal mimicking the emergency pings from his original crash 3 decades ago. We'll see if it still listens, he said. They waited. For 8 minutes, nothing happened. Then, the world changed. It began with static, not over the radio, but in the instruments. Analog dials spun. Glass screens dimmed, flickered, died. A deep hum vibrated through the fuselage, felt more than heard. Maverick reached instinctively for manual control, heart pounding. Then came the light, not a spotlight, not lasers, just a sphere, pulsing, silent, the size of a fighter jet, but impossibly still. It hovered 200 meters off their wingtip. Like it remembered them, Falcon stared at it. "I've seen this before," he whispered, and the light pulsed. Once, like a heartbeat. Without warning, the sphere darted forward. Maverick responded instantly. No hesitation. He chased. The Tomcat plunged into a dive, G-force pinning them both. Speed climbed, altitude dropped, but the sphere stayed ahead, just out of reach, as if leading them somewhere. "This is it," Falcon said. "This is where they vanished." And Maverick saw it. A point in the clouds, darker than shadow, curling like smoke, a tear in the sky. They crossed through. Everything went silent. Not the quiet of space, the quiet of memory. Inside the tear, time didn't exist. What they saw wasn't space or earth or stars. It was a void, filled with moments. Falcon's crash. Maverick's ejects. Hundreds of jets suspended in fragments of time, as if caught mid-thought. And the others were there too. The missing pilots, frozen in expression, eyes wide with awe or fear. It was impossible to say. Falcon reached out, touched one. The vision rippled. "These aren't just records," he said. "They're echoes." The sphere hovered above, pulsing faster. "You brought us back here," Maverick said to it. "Why?" The answer was not in words, but in feeling. Grief, understanding, warning. Something changed. The tear began to close. Maverick felt it. The air pressurizing, the controls pushing back. "We're losing it!" he shouted. Falcon didn't move. His eyes were locked on the suspended pilots. "I can stay," Maverick snapped. "No, you damn won't." He punched the throttle, pulled G's hard enough to black out. The sphere shrank behind them. The light faded, and just like that, they were out, back over the sea. They landed at a civilian strip in Yukon, fuel dry and hearts pounding. There was no fanfare, no sirens, just stillness. Falcon sat on the tarmac for a long time. "They'll come after us now," he said. Maverick nodded. "Let them." Within a week, every trace of their flight was gone. Radar logs scrubbed, fuel records erased. Even the flight deck security cam at the hangar showed static during takeoff. But someone saw, because 2 days later, Maverick received an unmarked envelope. Inside, a single photo, a satellite image. It showed the tier, still open, still waiting. They erased his name, buried his flight. But Falcon didn't die in that sky. He lived and came back with the truth. The kind you can't silence with a uniform or a file stamp. The kind you feel in your bones when you fly towards something bigger than fear. This wasn't a crash, it was a beginning.